Today we're looking at section 4.3 of the textbook, and we're talking about what happens when we are looking at the inheritance of two different genes. And this is going to bring into play Mendel's second law, which is the law of independent assortment. What that law says is that if you are looking at two different genes for two different traits, and those genes are found on two different chromosomes, then the inheritance of one of the traits does not affect the inheritance of the other trait. Essentially, the two different traits are independent. One does not affect the other. This is because the two genes are randomly split up and randomly packaged into the different gametes during meiosis. This is the process of independent assortment, and this happens during meiosis of gamete formation. It's kind of like when you make a variety pack of, fun fruits. Basically, all the flavors get split up randomly. You have an assorted pack or a variety pack. And this is true with chromosomes as they split up into the gametes as well. You get a random assortment or an independent assortment of genes. One gene does not affect another gene. This is also going to be true, we'll find out later on in the semester, if the genes are far apart on the same chromosome, and that's due to something called crossing over, but we'll come back to that later. Right now, let's consider pea plants again, and we'll talk about the color and the shape. So we have one parent that's round and yellow, and the other parent that's wrinkled and green. When we go to look at the offspring for these traits, remember that the traits are not inherited together. The round is completely independent of the yellow. The wrinkled is completely independent of the green. So that means when we have offspring for these two parents, the offspring can be the same. They could be round and yellow, or they could split up. So we could see round and green. We can also see wrinkled and yellow as well as wrinkled and green. So we see a splitting of the two genes, a division of the two traits. Our traits can then randomly mix up. You can be round from one parent and green from the other. Here's a Punnett square showing the inheritance from these two parents. So we see one parent passing on the round and yellow, the other parent passing on the wrinkled and green. The offspring then are a combination of the four traits that we had listed. Some are round and yellow, some are round and green, some are wrinkled and yellow, and some are wrinkled and green. So indeed, the traits do match up. When we look at this Punnett square, we see that what we actually have here is a two-factor cross, where we have big R, big Y, crossed with big R, big Y, and that's what's actually shown over here, giving us a ratio for this heterozygous crossed by a heterozygous, giving us a standard ratio of 9:3 to 3:1. This is important because if you ever see this ratio 9:3 to 3:1, you know immediately that this is a standard ratio for a dihybrid cross. So what we have is the standard ratio for heterozygous crossed by another parent that is heterozygous. Again, 9:3 to 3:1 is a standard ratio for those parents. Another standard cross is where one of our parents is heterozygous, that would be big B, big E, little e, and the other parent is homozygous recessive, little b, little e, little e. We're switching away from peas in this example, and we see some flies. The B, capital B is dominant, is the brown fly color, and little b recessive, black fly color. The E stands for the eye color. Capital E dominant is red eye, little e recessive is brown eye. So if we are crossing these parents, a heterozygous, which in this case is the female, and then the homozygous recessive, in this case the male, we see in the Punnett square that our offspring follow a standard ratio of 1:1:1:1. Again, this is a standard ratio for a heterozygous crossed by a homozygous recessive. So this is a second standard ratio that is very commonly seen in two-factor crosses. When you do some lab work later, you'll be asked to recognize these standard crosses, and you can come back and double check what the parents were. When you are solving problems with two genes, those Punnett squares can get pretty complicated, as you saw on those two slides. So I'm going to show you an easier way to do problem solving with two-factor crosses, and it's going to be using something called the product rule. So again, Punnett squares are pretty hard to draw when you have two or more traits. So we will be using the product rule for any number of traits, 2, 3, 4, or even more. What you will do when you're using the product rule is you will begin by doing a one-factor cross for each of the traits listed. So a simple 4-box Punnett square. You'll find the probability from the Punnett square for each of your traits. Then you simply multiply the different probability fractions together to get your answer. For example, if you are doing something with big R, little r, cross with big R, little r, and the second trait is big Y, cross with big Y, little y, you can do a Punnett square for the r's and then a Punnett square for the y's separately. And if you want to know what's the probability of having little r, little y, little y, you would just take little r, that's 1/4, and multiply it times little y, that's 1/4. That gives you an answer of 1/16 for little r, little y. Here's another example. Let's do this together. So we have two factors, and our parents are big R, big Y, little y. The other parent is big R, big Y, little y. Here are the Punnett squares for those parents. Big R, round, little r, wrinkled, big Y, yellow, little y, green. What is the probability of having a wrinkled green offspring? First, you're going to find the wrinkled probability. That is using the big R, little r Punnett square. Then you're going to find the green probability. That's using the big Y, little y Punnett square, the one below. 1/4 probability for wrinkled is right there, and 1/4 probability for green down below. We then are going to use the product rule. And to find something that's wrinkled and green, we multiply the two probabilities together. So 1/4 times 1/4, giving us 1/16. That tells you the probability of getting a wrinkled and green offspring. Here is that Punnett square showing you how you could have done it with a large Punnett square and you would have gotten exactly the same answer. 1 out of the 16 offspring would be both wrinkled and green. So the Punnett square will give you the exact same answer. It's just a little bit more difficult. Let's take a look if we have an example with 3 traits. In these cases, the Punnett squares would be very, very difficult and time-consuming to do. So product rule is really our only option. Let's take an example where one of our parents is big B, big H, little e. That's 3 different traits. And the other parent is little b, little h, big E, little e. This tells you what these different traits mean. We're looking at urine, eyelid color, and fingers for these individuals. So kind of an interesting variety of traits. Here are some pictures sort of showing you what that short finger versus normal finger looks like. Okay, so the short fingers are shown there. And the normal fingers, that'd be little e, are shown there. Okay, so the question here is, what is the chance that a child will have red urine, normal eyelids, and normal fingers? So we want to know from those 2 parents listed in blue, what is the probability that their offspring will have red urine, normal eyelids, and normal fingers? So we need to find the probabilities of each and then multiply them together. So we want to find what's the probability for red urine, that's little b, normal eyelids, little h, and normal fingers, little e. So we're going to have to do 3 Punnett squares. We'll do 1 Punnett square for urine color, 1 Punnett square for eyelids, and 1 Punnett square for fingers. This image shows you the 3 Punnett squares. Notice it has one parent along the tops and the other parent along the sides. Those come from the parents they gave us in the problem. Then we do a Punnett square for each. Red urine is little b, it has a probability of 1/2. Colored eyelids, big H, little h, has a probability of 1/2. And short fingers, this one is a probability of 1/2. We wanted to do slightly different combinations. We wanted to find what red urine was, normal eyelids, and normal fingers. So we did the little b, little h, and little e. So the ones that I circled. So red urine is 1/2, normal eyelids 1/2, and normal finger 1/2. So again, we need to now multiply those together, 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. So the probability of having a child that has red urine, normal eyelids, and normal fingers would be 1/8. So using the product rule, we are able to determine the probability of having a child with all 3 traits. Again, this will work for 2 traits or 3 or more.